Welcome once again to the Upper Room. Glad you've joined us, and after taking one lesson to step out of the Upper Room to celebrate our 1-year anniversary of the ministry of the Upper Room, we're back in the context of the Upper Room, John chapter 15. We'll also be in Isaiah chapter 6 if you want to turn there now. We're coming to you today from a place just outside Montrose called Montrose Forest Products. And as you can tell by the background, they do a lot of cutting of logs and shipping them for various purposes. Every time I get the smell of that cutting of lumber, it conjures up memories. You know how that is? The certain smells all of a sudden bring memories back to you. The memories that come to my mind when I smell the cutting of logs is when I was 17 years old and I was working at a place called Menke Lumber Company in Tacoma, Washington. It's a company that is owned by my brother-in-law's family, and it's really a large forestry production company. So my brother-in-law got me a job working there within their lumber mill, and my first job was on the green chain. Now, I'm guessing you don't know what the green chain is. It is a place where the logs have been cut into different sizes and shapes, and there are several guys on either side of this chain, actually several chains, as it comes from the cutting area, and you have to decide immediately what size that board is and pull it off onto basically a railroad car at that moment. And it was a hard job. I won't go into the details of that, but they discovered that I was not 18 years old after working there several weeks, and so the law said you had to be 18 years old, so he found me another job, and the other job was actually more difficult. It was called cleanup. Now, from the time I was young, the idea of cleanup was not a positive image in my mind. Anytime my parents said, it's time to clean up, I was like, oh. But this was cleanup on steroids. For this job, we went underneath the saws, so it was so loud you had to have earplugs in, and it was a room that was only about 5 feet high. Okay, so the saws were above us, the room was about 5 feet, so even a guy like me had to duck down, believe it or not. I felt really bad for the guys over 6 foot tall. What happens when you're underneath those saws is all that wet lumber that they've taken out of the water, having been shipped there over the water, it's cut and it falls, the sawdust falls down and fills up that room. And so the goal is to remove the sawdust from this giant room. The problem is it never stops filling up. So the job is never over. It's never completely clean. You're in a constant state of shoveling wet sawdust, trying to blow sawdust to different areas. And I tell you what, it was hard work. You didn't talk to anybody all day long. There's just a group of about 20 of you guys underneath here, so loud you can't hear. All you did was, I learned what this was, break time. And so it was a really hard job. What made it even more difficult was that our boss was just an absolute jackknob, okay? I'm just being honest with you. He would come down at different times and just start yelling at us as a group and individually, telling us, threatening us that if we didn't work faster and we didn't work harder, he'd kick us out on the street because there's people on the street that want that job. First of all, I couldn't imagine anybody wanting that job. But second of all, what he would do that just drove us crazy, and all of us, it just unnerved us, is he'd rip the shovel out of your hands and he'd take it and he'd start shoveling as fast as he could for about 15 seconds. And then he'd be breathing real hard and say, that's what you gotta do. Okay, so I don't remember his name. Let's call him Jim because I think that was his name. It doesn't really matter. But every time Jim came in to our area of work, everybody just thought, oh, here we go again, all right? I hated that job so much that just the smell of sawdust, the smell of logs being cut, the sound of them being cut, it just made me sick to my stomach, honestly. I'm past that. Sitting here in front of this forestry business, I'm not sick to my stomach, but for years I was, because I dreaded going there. I hated that job. And again, the job was difficult, it was good for me, But more than that, my boss was just intolerable. And so, eventually I got a different job, but I did that for at least 8 or 9 weeks, and it was 8 or 9 of the longest weeks of my life. Now, the point of me telling you that story is not for you to still feel sorry for me. It was actually really good for me to experience that. But we've all had bosses like that, I think. Maybe not exactly like him, but chances are if you've worked a number of different jobs as you grew up and became adults, you eventually run into a boss who is absolutely no fun. Not that bosses have to be fun, but they make your life miserable. That's your first discussion question. Share with the group that you're with about a time when you had a boss that either didn't really care for, or he was just making your life, or she was just making your life miserable, and you couldn't wait to be done with that job, move on to something else. All right? Hopefully you've never had that experience, but I'm guessing most of us have. Share with one another a little bit about that, and then we'll get back into John chapter 15 and see what having a boss has to do with what Jesus says to his disciples. I'll bet you had some great discussions. I would have loved to have heard some boss stories. But we're going to move on, and we're back in the upper room. It's John 15. We're actually going to just cover one verse, and we're going to focus actually on a couple words in that verse. But to give it context, we'll go back to verse 26, and then that provides the understanding of what's happening in verse 27. So Jesus, again, is addressing the fears and concerns and just that overwhelming feeling the disciples must have of what now? What's next? What do we do? The fear, the apprehension. We go back to verse 26 and we read this. I will send you the advocate, the Spirit of truth. He will come to you from the Father and will testify all about me. Okay, in lesson 44, we talked at length about the advocate. And if you missed that, please go back. Boy, if you don't understand the advocate, if you don't understand the Spirit of truth and the role he plays in our lives, you're missing out. I tell you, life without him is not life at all. So now we go to the verse we'll focus on. It happens to be the last verse in John chapter 15. Here we go. Verse 27. And you must also testify about me, because you have been with me from the beginning of my ministry. Okay, so these guys at the very beginning, 3.5 years ago, were called to follow Jesus. They followed Jesus. They've seen it all. They've heard it all. They've experienced it all. And he's saying, so you will testify about what you have seen and heard and experienced. Now, there's something really obvious here that we're going to touch on. We don't want to miss it. But then there's something subtle that I want to focus on today, all right? So the obvious is they will be, and the word is actually marteo, they will be martyrs. They will be witnesses. It was actually a legal term for anybody in the court system who testified, okay? And in the case of the disciples, it will cost them their lives, but they will testify as to what we have seen and heard and experienced. Peter begins his letter by talking about that. I think John even mentions it as well in one of his letters. But that will happen. That's really obvious. Really obvious. Now you could say, well, that was just to those 11 disciples. But surely by now you realize that what was said to those disciples, for the most part, is also applicable to us 2,000 years later, because we too are disciples. We're not the original, we're not the capital A apostles, but we are followers of Jesus. And so if it applied to those followers of Jesus, it certainly applies to us. So the big picture, the obvious thing here is that when you have experienced Jesus, it just makes sense to testify about that. Now, studies are showing, and again, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but studies are showing that most Christians, most believers, and I always use those quotation marks because it can mean anything to be a believer in Jesus, to be a Christian, but most Christians and believers are found to never during their life have testified to somebody about Jesus. Meaning somebody that doesn't know Jesus, they're unaware of who he is, very few, if any of us, actually are living that out. So intellectually, you and I would say, well, of course, we're supposed to testify of Jesus, and we believe that. Experientially, studies show it's not happening for the most part. Okay, that's the obvious thing, I think, and we could beat that to death. I think I know about my life, whether I'm testifying to who Jesus is. Only you have to answer to Jesus about that. And so we'll leave it there. What I want to spend the rest of our time on, however, is a subtle thing that jumped out at me. I really had never seen it before, but it really jumps out. So let's get to it in verse 27 as well. But I'd love to try to place myself in that setting. Whatever Jesus is teaching on, whatever they're experiencing, I'd love to say, now, if I were there, how would I be hearing this? How would I be reacting to this? And as I thought about this in terms of us in the modern world, in the West, those of us who call ourselves followers of Christ, sitting or actually reclining in that room, and we hear what he has to say, I just have a sense that we would have a reaction to it. All right? And so I'm going to present it this way by saying that our question today that we want to answer is, what is our biggest problem? What is our biggest problem as followers of Jesus? Now, to get into that, I'm going to ask you to do another discussion question, and this should take you some time. All right? You're either going to have to stop the video or pause it time after time after time. But the point is this. I want you to list together as a group of people, and it doesn't matter whether there's 4 of you or 30 of you, it doesn't matter at all. I want you to discuss what are the problems in life that we face. And I want you to be very detailed about that, okay? Not just general categories, but specific problems that we face. Because these specific problems tend to overwhelm us. And then I want to get on to what is the real big problem that we face as followers of Jesus. Have a great discussion. Okay, I hope you have a detailed list. There should be so many items on that list that it would take a while to even read. The basic categories, I think we could do that very easily. Certainly health is a problem for many people. We consider the weather from time to time a real problem. That's why we have an entire channel dedicated 24 hours a day to the weather. Our local radio station, by the way, every 15 minutes gives a weather update, which just totally confuses me because everybody can get on their phone in a matter of a couple seconds and know what the weather's going to be like. Anyway, weather tends to be what we consider maybe a problem, potential problem in what we want to do. So health and weather, relationships, both family and friends, that's a huge category, right? Relationships as far as marriage, children, those can be potential problems that we have to deal with in life. How about taxes? How about figuring out how much to pay back to the government, and then all the thought that goes into, and what in the world are they doing with it? All right. These are all basic categories. And all those basic categories can lead us into one big problem, and that is depression. Depression. So many people in our culture are depressed because of those other problems that they don't seem to be able to get out from underneath. Okay, so those are problems that we deal with, realities of life. Good to recognize what they are. I want to go on to what I'm going to call the big problem, the real problem. And I do believe if we can get this real problem resolved, then those other problems will really lessen in impact and might not even show up on our screen at all. Okay, let's get into this discussion about what the real problem is. And I want to do it in a really kind of unique, different kind of way. I want to read a quote to you that comes from an author by the name of Neil Postman. And he wrote a book, I think I've mentioned it before. It's called Amusing Ourselves to Death. It was written several years ago. I want to read this quote to you, and then I'm going to have you talk about it, all right? Because I think it's fascinating. It can go in a couple different directions, but let's get to it. Neil Postman writes this: the inexorable, what he means by that is the unstoppable ticking of the clock may have had more to do with the weakening of God's supremacy than all the writings produced by the philosophers of the Enlightenment. That is to say, the clock introduced a new form of conversation with God, in which God appears to have been the loser. Okay, your leader has this quote in front of them. You can go back and look at the different parts of it. I find it fascinating. I think it'll produce a great discussion amongst you. What do you think he means by this? What are the implications of this quote? Okay, when I read this quote, I was actually reading it while exercising, and it was one of those things where I wanted to stop exercising, which I usually do want to stop exercising, but I wanted to stop exercising and underline it. I went back to it later. I think what Postman is saying is that it wasn't until we were able to keep track of time, second by second, minute by minute, hour by hour, in that way, that all of a sudden our discussion with God changed. And all of a sudden, in a strange way, we started holding God accountable. Does that make sense? Now it was, we live minute by minute by minute, so God, you're accountable to answer to us, answer our questions, answer our problems, deal with the issues in our life that we ask you about. We're going to track it by seconds and minutes and hours. You'll talk to someone and they'll say, I've been praying about this forever, and it's been a week. See, we measure time, and what Postman says is that's done an interesting thing to our conversation with God. Now think about it. Over the Old Testament times, Moses was out in the wilderness tending to sheep for 40 years. We don't know of any grumbling or, God, where are you? Why don't you show up? I'm tired of this, sheep business. The Israelites wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, and they complained. They certainly did. But it wasn't a time thing, I don't think. It was more of a just disgruntled attitude. Things used to be so good in Egypt kind of idea. And then Jesus himself, not until his 30th year of life, did he start to do things that people noticed as ministry, to our knowledge. Other than his mom, really nobody on earth knew who he was. 30 years on this earth, that's a long time before all of a sudden miracles start happening and things start going on that people say, you're something special, could you be the Messiah? I say all that just to say, time to us today is a big deal. It is a big deal. Now, one of the directions we could go is get into the conversation about time-space continuum and how God is outside of that. And I find that incredibly intriguing, especially when it comes to our death. But we're not going to talk about that. But there is a big difference, isn't there, between how we count time and how God counts time. We count time in seconds and minutes. He counts time in generations and epochs. In 2 Peter 3:8, Peter reminds us that a day is as 1,000 years to God, and 1,000 years is as a day to God. Meaning, there is no time. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about a day or 1,000 years. It makes no difference. He is outside of our time-space continuum that we are trapped in, and it's all we know. Back to Postman. Postman says, when we gained the ability to track time second by second, minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day, we now changed our conversation with God. Now we felt like he is accountable to us. God, I've been asking you about this for several minutes, and I haven't heard from you. You need to answer for why you are not responding, why you're not acting in my life, that kind of thing. All right? So I think that's a really interesting concept that I think you'll enjoy talking about maybe at the end of this message. But I want to go in a whole different direction with that and step back even one more step and say, so what really is that issue? And I believe the issue is this. As we have lived in this minute-by-minute life, we now feel like we are in charge of each minute. And we're disappointed when God does not enter into each minute, into each day, in a way that we can easily see and answer our questions, answer our issues. Does that make sense? So in a way, God is now accountable to us. It's as though, and that's why Postman says, the result of this is that God is the loser. Well, you know what he means by that. God never loses. But in our relationship together, we put him in a place where you're not doing what you should be doing. I'm going to play God, and you should play my subject and do what I wish. So let's not get hung up on the time-space continuum, as much fun as that is to talk about. I want to talk about the attitude. And that's kind of what I was just saying. The attitude that we now have, now that we can track second by second, minute by minute, hour by hour, is that God should answer to us in that time frame. He's responsible to do that. Okay? We have stepped into his role, actually. Let's go back to verse 27 and read it once again. And you must also testify about me, because you have been with me from the beginning of my ministry. Okay, I want to focus in on you must testify. Verse 26 used the same word. The Holy Spirit will testify. That's what he will do. It's the same word that Jesus uses then back to back when he says, now you must testify. One subtle difference is it's a different tense. That word takes on a different tense, which means not just the Spirit will do that, but this is now you must do that. He is dictating to his disciples, this is what you must do. So the two words I want to focus on for the rest of our time are those two words, you must. You must. Now today, I believe most of us live our lives in such a way that if we were there in that moment, we transport ourselves back to that upper room 2,000 years ago. I honestly believe that many of us would look at him and say, wait, are you telling me what I have to do? Is that what you're saying? I have to do something? Nobody tells me what I have to do. I'm in charge of my life. I make my decisions, all right? And nobody's going to come tell me what I have to do. That is the attitude. That is the mentality of the modern Christian, at least all of them that I've met. Not all of them, but a lot of the Christians, believers, we live with this attitude. Now, we may not be so brash as to say that, but in our mind we're thinking that. I live my life on my terms, and here you come along and say, no, you must do this. And that, my friends, is our biggest problem. The word we use for this is lordship. Okay, you've heard the phrase, Jesus is Lord. That's not a word we use anymore. And so we're going to insert boss. Boss doesn't even come close. Okay, we use that as the title for this message. Let me tell you, boss doesn't even come close. But Lord means not only does Jesus have input in our life, he rules over our life. And that is significant. And a misunderstanding of that leads us to live life on our terms instead of life on his terms. And when we live life on our terms, everything, quite honestly, goes in the toilet. It really does. I mean, it really gets ugly. And then we wonder, how did my life turn out so terribly? I want to tell you, it goes back to the day when you either didn't decide to follow him as Lord, or you never thought about giving him lordship of your life, never gave him lordship of my life. I continue to be in charge of my life. Again, it's not even just that he has input into our lives, it's that he rules over our lives. So in that moment, and again, I know it's a little subtle nuance in that conversation in the upper room, but when he says, you must testify, he is definitely saying, I run your life, and this is what you will do. Did you notice that the disciples, at least in the text, didn't raise their hand and say, wait a minute, I did not sign up for that. Why is that? I want to explain why they didn't do that, explain why we shouldn't do that, even though so many of us do. I did not sign up for that. Maybe nobody explained this to you before, but this is what you signed up for. You say, no, I signed up to be saved. Yes, the result of having him as Lord is salvation, but you can't leave out the Lord part of the equation. Again, so you don't miss it, Jesus doesn't just have input on your life, he rules over your life if you are a follower of Jesus. Okay? And maybe you never wanted that and you don't want that, that's fine. That's fine. But don't call yourself a follower of Jesus, because the followers, the disciples of Jesus, have placed themselves under his lordship. Okay, what's the practical implications of this? Wow, they are so far reaching. Let's take again some basic categories. Okay, how about deciding what you will do with your life? That's his decision, not yours. How about where will I live? His decision. How about what kind of an occupation I will enter into? His decision. How about whether I go to college and where I go to college? His decision, not yours. How about dating? All right? It'll be his decision whether you date at all, and if you do, what you do with that idea of dating. How about marriage? That's a big one. His decision. It's his decision who you marry, and it's his decision how you live out that marriage. Do you think we would have 50% of the people in the church getting divorced if we really believed in his lordship? That we would say, Lord, I will do this marriage how you want it, not how I want it. Okay? Now, you can give me all the exceptions you want, but all these issues in our life that become complicated issues and difficult problems, I believe stem back to, it was me making the decisions. And I have a way of really messing things up. Don't you? How about what you do with money? His decision, not yours. How about purchases? What I purchase, what we buy for ourselves? His decision. And whose is it? That's up to him, right? How about your friends? That's his decision. Does that make sense? Every little area of our lives. How about time? How about time? How I spend my time. That's his decision. Not yours. Not mine. And in fact, you know what else is his decision? How much time you and I have left. That's his decision. It's not our government's decision. It's not the people around me to influence how much time I have left. It is God's decision. It is Jesus' decision as to how long we have left. How about this planet? His decision. Okay? You can drive a different car if you want. You can do all you want, but it'll be his decision when this planet burns up. Does that make sense? It is a way of thinking. It's an attitude about life that most of us have never really grasped. And it's really important that we grasp it. And there's one deeper thing I want to go into, okay? So if I have a problem with lordship, what do I really have a problem with? All right? We'll go a little bit deeper on that. I want to suggest to you that if you have a problem with his lordship, with his being boss in your life, with him owning your life, I believe you have a problem with his holiness. In other words, you don't understand his holiness. This concludes the first part of the two parts of this lesson we're calling Boss. And what I'd like for you to do is to take time between these two lessons, preferably a week, and really evaluate where you are in your life regarding the lordship of Jesus. All right? We mentioned all those categories and really kind of look at all the different areas of your life and ask the difficult question, does Jesus really own that part of my life? And if he does, and you can string all that together, I think we're a step closer to Jesus being Lord of our lives. And that's essential. In the next part, we'll go into what may be an even deeper cause as to why lordship of Jesus is such a challenge for us. Again, the big picture is what is our biggest problem? I think we've arrived at it, but we want to go a little bit deeper in the next part. Thanks for joining us. Enjoy your time off to consider these ideas, and we'll get back to it next week. Welcome once again to the Upper Room, and we're going into the second part of a two-part lesson we have entitled Boss. It has to do with the biggest problem we face as followers of Jesus, and if you missed the other part, let me give you a real quick summary of it, and that is that of all the problems we deal with, I honestly believe that they can all be resolved if we get back to the lordship of Jesus. That is, that not only does Jesus have input into our lives, but he actually owns our lives. And we go to him for the answers to every question we face, every choice we make. And so, having gone through that lesson, we now are going to go a little deeper because there might be a deeper issue. And I mentioned it right at the end of the last lesson. And the deeper issue has to do with our understanding of the holiness of God. So let's go deeper into that, and then we'll conclude the second part of the two parts of Boss, the lesson about Jesus owning our lives and us submitting our lives to Him. I've used this quote from A.W. Tozer many times. It's such a great quote. I'm going to go back to it one more time. He says this: "What comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us." So when you think about God, what comes to mind? Many of us will say, well, love, right? And then we define love how we want to, not how He defines it. What comes to mind? And this is what I want to challenge. If God's holiness does not come to mind, that in turn says a lot about us and how we live this life. So earlier I asked you to turn to Isaiah chapter 6. Hopefully you have that, had your finger there or whatever. Flip over to it, Isaiah chapter 6. Let's talk about His holiness. Let's give an example that you've probably seen before, but I want to go a little deeper into it. So the setting is the 8th century BC, before the birth of Christ, and there was a king named Uzziah, and Uzziah was a great king. He really was one of the great kings. However, later in his life, he became pretty prideful, began to take credit for all the things that were being done, forgot about who God was, and in the end, he decides to usurp the authority of the priests in the temple and does something he was forbidden from doing. The result is God allows him to die of leprosy. And what a horrendous death it is. He dies alone in isolation and in pain and suffering because he quit giving God credit and honoring Him with his life. Big deal, really big deal. So it's the 8th century, and a prophet by the name of Isaiah goes into the temple, okay? And he goes into the temple because he's probably thinking, Lord, people are really upset. They loved King Uzziah. They all may not have been aware of how prideful he'd become. And so they are mourning his death, and they're basically saying, what now? What's next? Who will be our king? All these questions. And Isaiah is probably asking the same question when he enters the temple in chapter 6. So here we go, Isaiah chapter 6, verse 1. "In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and exalted, seated on a throne, and the train of His robe filled the temple. Above Him were seraphim," that are angels, "each with 6 wings." Interesting that these angels have 6 wings. We'll talk about that. "With 2 wings they covered their faces, with 2 wings they covered their feet, and with 2 they were flying." Okay, so get the picture. One, of course, pair was so they could fly. Secondly, they had a pair of wings that covered their feet, then a pair that covered their eyes. Very significant. Let's go into that. Let's start with the pair of wings that covered their feet. Why would it be important that they cover their feet? Well, let's go back to Exodus chapter 3, verse 1. This will be a very familiar passage to you, but I want to read it to really connect the two. "Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I'll go over and see this strange sight. Why doesn't this bush burn up? When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses." Can you imagine hearing the voice of God when you're just out here looking at one of these bushes? Moses said, "Here I am." "Do not come any closer," God said. "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." We often remember that Moses was told to take off his Nikes. We don't remember why sometimes. And that is, he was stepping into the very presence of God. And here's the deal with the feet. The feet represent us being creatures, not the Creator. All right? Our feet attach us to this earth, which means this is our identity. This is where we live. Okay, so even though the angels in the Isaiah vision, they're not necessarily with their feet on the ground, the feet represent that they are creatures. They have been created. They are not God. They are not like God. The fact that we have feet that connect us to this earth remind us that we are created beings, not like God. That's a big deal. So they covered their feet in that moment because it's holy ground now. They're not just on earth, they're on God's territory. They're in God's arena. And he says this is a holy place. Okay? How about the eyes? Exodus chapter 33, verse 19. And the Lord said, I will cause all my goodness to pass in front of you. He's talking to Moses. Moses wants to see God, and he asked for that permission to see God's face. So we pick it up in verse 19. And the Lord said, I'll cause my goodness to pass in front of you, and I'll proclaim my name, the Lord, in your presence. I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. But, he says, you cannot see my face, for no one may see me and live. Verse 21. Then the Lord said, there is a place near me where you may stand on a rock. When my glory passes by, I'll put you in a cleft in the rock and cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will remove my hand, and you will see my back, but my face must not be seen. Back there is literally hindquarters. He says, the best I can do for you, Mo, is you can look at my hindquarters, and that probably won't kill you. But you look at my face, you don't survive that. What is the point here? Well, it's really interesting. The holiness of God is such that as it radiates from his face, we will not survive seeing that, at least while we are creatures on this earth. You might remember that Moses comes off the mountain and he has a veil, right? Just in seeing his hindquarters, his face is so bright that people won't be able to look at it. Isn't that amazing to you? Now it's interesting that Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5, verse 8, blessed are the pure in heart, for they will what? They will see God. There will come a day when we have been purified by Jesus, and we, I believe, are no longer in this place that we can look upon the face of God. But it's not now, and it's not here. John writes in 1 John chapter 3, verse 2, we are children of God, and what we will be has not yet been made known. Did you get that? There is something coming that we don't even understand yet. It's not known, but we know that when he appears, we shall be like him. Who's he talking about? We, the whole world? No. Those who are his followers, those who are committed to his lordship, who see him as God over their lives. We shall be like him, for few shall see him as he is. So let's go back to Isaiah's vision in Isaiah chapter 6, starting now in verse 3. Remember, the seraphim are flying around, and they were calling to one another, holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. Notice what they call him, Lord. Notice how they describe him, holy, holy, holy. The whole earth is full of his glory. At the sound of their voices, the doorposts and thresholds shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. Verse 5, woe to me, I cried, Isaiah says. I am ruined. I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty. What I want you to see here is in this vision of Isaiah's, he ties his lordship to his holiness. I firmly believe that when we don't appreciate the holiness of God, we will not see him as Lord, and we will not accept him as Lord of our lives. And then our lives unravel from that point forward. Notice the repetition of holy from the angels. See, you and I, in our day and age, when we're writing something, we're emailing or typing up something, if we want to emphasize a word, we underline it, we italicize it, we bold it, we put it in quotation marks, right? We do something as an indicator to say, this you can't miss. In biblical times, times gone by, instead of bold-facing or italicizing or underlining, what they did is they repeated. Thus you have Jesus saying, truly, truly, I tell you. Emphasis on, I'm telling you truth. So the emphasis by the angels, the seraphim flying around the throne, is incredible. 3 times to say the same word means there's nothing more you need to know than he is holy. Now, I want you to think about the implications of that. When we think of God, remember what Tozer said, what comes to mind when you think of God is the most important thing about you. Most people, most of us would say, well, he's love. He's just. He is peace. Do you know that nowhere in Scripture does it say God is love, love, love? God is just, just, just. God is merciful, merciful, merciful. God is peace, peace, peace. It never says that. The only thing it says is God is holy. He's holy. He's holy. He'll say it again in the book of Revelation. Holiness and his lordship, his ownership of all the universe, including my life and your life, our little measly lives, is unquestionably tied to his holiness. Again, if you and I don't appreciate his holiness and are consumed with that idea, we will probably not be willing to accept his lordship. Okay, the word holy is used all the time, right? There was a famous Cubs announcer that used to say, "Holy cow!" All right, we use the word holy a lot. What does it mean? It means set apart, different, a cut above. Now, quick story. Christy's parents are here with us. We just celebrated their 60th wedding anniversary. Isn't that incredible? So fun to celebrate them and what they have done through their marriage. And it hasn't just been a marriage, it's been a godly marriage and produced godly people. But we've been celebrating them, and I was thinking about memories with them. And the first time they visited us after we were married, we lived in Southern California in an apartment complex there. And they came to visit, and we had a pool in the complex, and so we were going to head down to the pool. And so I really didn't know them well. I mean, I met them years and years ago, but I didn't know them well at this point. But when we got ready to go down to the swimming pool, her dad, Paul, came out. It was very apparent to me that he doesn't go to the pool very often. He hadn't planned on going to the pool other than he had some swimming shorts. But with his swimming shorts, he was wearing on his feet, speaking of the feet and the creatureness of us, he was wearing black dress shoes with black dress socks. And he was going to walk down to the pool in Southern California without outfit. I had compassion. People who don't think I have compassion, I had compassion. I went into our bedroom, I found some dress shoes, found some black dress socks, put them on, and the two of us walked to the pool, followed by our wives from a great distance because they were so embarrassed. We walked to the pool in amazing fashion, swimsuits and black dress socks and black dress shoes. I tell you that, and I laugh to this day of how much fun that was, and the stares that we got. Nobody else does that in Southern California. And I think of that because we could be described as holy. If only the holy description was different than everybody else. But there's one more part to the holiness, and that is a cut above. We were different, but we were not a cut above. I know our wives didn't believe we were a cut above at all. We were a cut somewhere else. We were not holy because we were not a cut above. When God is described as holy, he is different than us. He is not like us. He says, my thoughts are higher than your thoughts. My ways are higher than your ways. He is not bound to this earth like we are. Not only that, though, he's not just different. He's not just set apart. He is a cut above. He is something that we cannot attain. And it is that nature of his that if we understand what happened with Isaiah, we would be in awe of. And so when he says, do this, we would fall to our knees, or in the disciples' case, they would continue to recline at the table and nod their heads and say, yes, we will. Yes, we will. We will testify to what we've seen and experienced and heard from you. Today, not so much. He's not Lord of many of our lives because I don't think we're in awe of his holiness. I don't think we think that much about his holiness. Holiness to us is a really strange thing. On the one hand, we're attracted to it. On the other hand, we're repulsed by it. On the one hand, we're drawn to holiness. On the other hand, we want to run away from it. We're a bit confused about holiness. Most of us think that although unique to be a holy person, it's not something I aspire to because I don't want to be seen as different, as strange, as peculiar. And that concerns us because we're more concerned with what other people think than with identifying with the holiness of God. I want to take you back to June 27th of 1975. In Chicago, Illinois, it was the PGA Tour stopping for the Western Open. And something happened there that was really interesting. three guys were golfing together, three professional golfers, and one of them was Lee Trevino. He was known as the Merry Mex, meaning he was a happy-go-lucky guy, happened to be from Mexico. He didn't see that label as being demeaning or anything like that. He loved it. And as they were golfing in Chicago that summer day, lightning struck and knocked three of them to the ground. Lee Trevino was one of the golfers knocked to the ground. After the round, a reporter rushed up to these guys, specifically to the Merry Mex, and said, "Tell us about that." And he said, "Well, here's what I learned from that." He said, "When the Almighty wants to play through, you let him play through." Okay, if you're not a golfer, I know we have a lot of golfers that watch this, you get that meaning, right? Someone wants to play through, it's like, you better step aside and let them play through. So on the one hand, it seems like Lee Trevino had a real respect for the holiness of God. But then he went on to say this, "What I should have done," he said, "is I should have held my one iron above my head, because no one can hit a one iron, including God." Okay, so he went from God is almighty and you step aside for him to God can't hit a one iron. Again, if you're a golfer, you understand what he's saying is nobody hits a one iron. I guess Arnold Palmer hit a one iron, but nobody else carries a one iron in their bag. Can't be done, doesn't work. And he was saying God can't even hit a one iron. We're that confused about the holiness of God, I believe. Okay, you may be saying, well, Isaiah stood in the presence of Almighty God. These disciples are in the presence of Jesus, totally different things. No, they are one and the same. And I guarantee you those disciples reclining there that night would tell you it was holy ground. There was nothing like Jesus. Nobody but nobody was like Jesus. And they knew that by now. So as a result of having experienced Jesus, they knew that there was no one like him. Now the question is, do we feel that way? Not do we think that way. Of course we think that way. You would answer that way if I ask about Jesus. You'd say, oh, there's no one like Jesus. But do we live that way? Do we live as though whatever Jesus says must be done? He is holy as God who filled the temple in Isaiah's vision. Now before we leave Isaiah's vision, I want to go back to the last thing he said. He said, I am ruined. That word ruined that he uses literally means I am undone, I'm coming apart at the seams. He felt like it was all falling apart on him. Like he could not survive this. A whole lot of shaking was going on. I'm not talking about Elvis here. A whole lot of shaking was going on when he saw God in the temple. He said the doorposts and thresholds were shaking, but he was shaking as well. So I want to read this quote to you that comes from R.C. Sproul in his incredible book, The Holiness of God. Couldn't recommend it more. Here's what he says about Isaiah. For the first time in his life, Isaiah really understood who God was. At the same instant, for the first time, Isaiah really understood who Isaiah was. And that is the big problem. We asked the question, what's the big problem for us? We don't truly understand who God is, and we don't truly understand who we are. We are not God. We are not in charge of our lives. And he understood that. I'm coming apart at the seams. I'm not in charge of anything. I have no control over anything. Is that how you see your relationship with God? How you see your life? Again, I can't emphasize it enough. Our biggest problem is that we don't truly understand who God is, and we don't truly understand who we are. He is holy. We are not. The result is, I should desire more than anything to become like him, to be set apart, to be living a cut above life. The Hebrew writer puts it this way in chapter 12, verse 14. Work at living a holy life, for those who are not holy will not see the Lord. Discussion question. I think this will be your last one. What do you think the Hebrew writer means by that? I hope you're having a great discussion about holiness and what it really means to you, how close you might think you are to the reality of the holiness of God, understanding it, appreciating it. I want to go back to C.S. Lewis, who says this, how little people know who think that holiness is dull. When one meets the real thing, it is irresistible. We're so worried, so concerned, so anxious in the modern church that people would be bored, that they would come to church and be bored. That's the worst thing that could ever happen. No, the worst thing that could ever happen is that people think that holiness is not irresistible, that you can't live without it. And yet C.S. Lewis knew what he was speaking of. Those disciples that night reclining understood holiness. They lived with holiness, they experienced holiness, and so when holiness spoke and said, you will do this, they didn't bat an eye. They didn't question it at all. What are the things Jesus is telling you to do? If you say, I don't know, well then get into the red letters. Get into the red letters. Get into the New Testament. Because he has a lot to say about how this life is to be lived. Do you bat an eye? Do you give a second thought? Or you just say, okay, the Holy One has spoken. My job is to live in respect and obedience to that and live out the life he has for me. So what I'm saying is the phrase Jesus is Lord is the practical application of the holiness of God. So if I struggle with his lordship in my life, that means I've not appreciated the holiness of God. You might be saying, Steve, I think you're making way too much over two little words in verse 27, the two words you must. I think you've gone way overboard, made a big deal, a mountain out of a molehill. I just think you're way off base here. I can understand that you might have that feeling, and I think I understand where it comes from, and that is maybe you've never been deep enough in Scripture to understand it. Let's give a real quick tour of what the New Testament says, what Jesus said himself about this topic. John chapter 13, verse 12, he's washed the disciples' feet there in the upper room. We talked about this, but let me remind you, when he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. And he said this, do you understand what I have done for you? He asked them. You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. See why we emphasize so much the understanding of him as our teacher? Why we go to his words? But it's not just that he's teacher, he's Lord. He says, I am Lord. Jesus claims there to be in charge of our lives. We need to deal with that and say, do I really believe that in the way I live? In Acts 2:36, Peter is concluding the sermon at Pentecost, and here's what he says. Therefore, let all Israel be assured of this. God has made this Jesus, he is speaking, whom you crucified, both Lord and Messiah. He is over all, and he is the one that was sent to show us who God is. We move on to Romans chapter 14, verse 8. If we live for the Lord. And if we die for the Lord. So whether we live or die, we belong to the Lord. Pretty simple, right? For this very reason, Christ died and returned to life so that he might be the Lord of both the dead and the living. He is Lord of all. Doesn't matter if you're dead or alive, he's your Lord. That's the way it is. That's why we live for him. Philippians chapter 2, verse 9. Therefore God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. What will we confess? You are Lord. And you can do it now or you can do it later, but you're going to do it. Remember the old Fram commercials? I don't even know what Fram was. It's some kind of filter, air filter, oil filter, I don't know. And remember, that was their line. It was a very captivating line. They said, you can pay us now or you can pay us later. All right? You can pay us now by buying one of our filters, or you can pay us later by us fixing your engine. Either way, you're going to pay. That's what Paul is saying. He's saying, you can bow down and confess Jesus as Lord now, or you can do it later, but you're going to do it. I am going to bow before Jesus. We can do it now, or we can do it later, but we're going to do it. You might as well do it now, because later will be too late, actually. John is now experiencing the revelation of Jesus in Revelation chapter 17, verse 14. They will wage war against the Lamb, but the Lamb will triumph over them, because he is Lord of lords and King of kings. And with him will be his called, chosen, and faithful followers. We are called. We are chosen. The question is, are we faithful? Are you a faithful follower? If you are, you'll be with the Lamb. And he is Lord of lords and King of kings. That's who he is. On to Revelation chapter 19, verse 11. I saw heaven standing open, and there before me was a white horse, whose rider is called Faithful and True. With justice he judges and wages war. His eyes are like blazing fire, and on his head are many crowns.
He has a name written on him that no one knows but he himself. He is dressed in a robe dipped in blood, and his name is the Word of God. We mentioned this before, but there's a thing going around amongst Christians where they say you shouldn't be worshiping the Word of God. We're just told by John it's one and the same. His name is the Word of God. Verse 14. The armies of heaven were following him, riding on white horses and dressed in fine linen, white and clean. Coming out of his mouth is a sharp sword with which to strike down the nations. He will rule them with an iron scepter. He treads the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God Almighty. On his robe and on his thigh he has this name written. He's gonna have a tattoo, and the tattoo says King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Okay. Am I making a big deal, too big of a deal, about Jesus saying, you must do this? Would you do it? Would you sit there and say, absolutely, no questions asked? Are you doing it? Are you testifying to who he is? He is King. He is Lord. He is over all. And when he makes demands of us, we say, you bet. When he tells us to jump, we say, how high? Okay, let's get really practical. I'm not sure that many of us are at that place where we're willing to say, Jesus, you are Lord of every part of my life. Maybe I can give you this 4-step process that I think is really practical, as I've heard it before and seen it in people's lives, in my own life. And it goes like this. Level number 1, or the first step is this, that we basically just say to Jesus, we just say, well, I'm going to do what I want to do. I think that's about 80% of Christians I know. I'm going to do what I want to do. Okay? If I want to live with my girlfriend, I'm going to live with my girlfriend. All right? If I want to cheat on my taxes, I'm going to cheat on my taxes. I'm going to do whatever I want to do. Okay? That's level 1. Level 2 is, give me what I want, and I'll give you what you want, Lord. Okay? Does that make sense? First of all, here's what I want out of life, and then I'll give you back something, like I'll go to church once in a while. Level 3 is, give me what I want, and then I'll give you something of equal value. Okay, now we're bargaining and saying, I'll make this fair for you, Lord. I'll evaluate what it is you've done for me, and then I'll give you what I think is fair in return. That's level 3. Level 4 is, I'll do whatever you tell me to do, no matter what. Even if I never get what I hope to get. That doesn't matter. I will do whatever you tell me to do. I will do the thing that you have asked me to do, no matter what. That is what it means to live under the lordship of Jesus. Whatever you want, Lord, you got it. It doesn't have to be reasonable in my mind. It doesn't have to be practical in my mind. It doesn't have to make me feel comfortable. You are Lord. I truly believe that if you and I can come to an appreciation of the holiness of God and tremble in his presence, understand who he is, understand who we are, and that we are not in his role, I believe it is then that we'll begin to live in the lordship of Jesus. The problem is we are so fixated on what's going on in this earth. We're so fixated on ourselves that it doesn't even occur to us to stay focused on the holiness of God, his greatness, and how we're just so fortunate to live in his shadow. We began this lesson in front of the lumber company there in Montrose, and I want to finish it up by finishing that loop. I told you about my boss and how I just couldn't stand the guy. About a year later, pick the story up, I was with some friends at a thing called Jesus Northwest. It's kind of a Woodstock for Christians, for those of you that are old enough to understand that reference. Anyway, yeah, you know, all kinds of stuff going on, people walking around fully clothed, and listening to concerts and doing all the Christian things that we like to do. And we were walking through Jesus Northwest up there in the Seattle area, and lo and behold, guess who I bump into? My old boss. And he was just so glad to see me, and he was carrying a pile of books, and I glanced at him, and they were different Bibles and commentaries, holy books. And I pretended to be glad to see him. But I'll never forget walking away and my friend saying, who was that? And I described who he was, and I said this. I was very disappointed. I said, he either was a Christian when I knew him a year ago, but didn't act like it on the job, or he has become a Christian in the past year, and I'm not sure which. And I'm going to be very vulnerable with you and tell you that I was disappointed, because I wanted him to get what was coming to him. You know? I mean, he treated me so poorly. And how many of us live that way? I look at the people who treat me poorly, who don't treat me as I think I deserve, and I cast judgment on them. In that moment, quite honestly, I played God. Not a holy God, a very carnal God, a little g God. You see, I at that point could attest to you what Lordship of Jesus meant. I could not attest to you through my life the living of the Lordship of Jesus. Jesus said to them, "You must testify about me. I'm in charge." They didn't blink an eye. They didn't take pause. They didn't raise their hand and argue. What would you have done? I'm concerned about what I might have done. I'm concerned about what I might have done if I was reclining there at that table 2,000 years ago. Jesus is Lord. He is King of Kings, Lord of Lords. He's coming back. I can't wait. Make sure that you're living in a way that is anticipating that moment. May it be today. Thanks for joining us.